presentation has to do with adjectival syntax especially, and maybe if there is time I'll say something about parties, semantic analysis, and some questions with that particular analysis and so on. So the idea is, once again, to try to give a unique hierarchy of adjectives and adjective classes across languages, so that this is an exercise in seeing how two different orderings that you find in English, Germanic more clearly, and Slavic on one side, and Romance on the other side, can be reduced to very simple analysis which captures the unity and in a simple way may also account for how they differ. Well, let me start right away with the idea. Namely, the first thing to consider is that adjectives come with two very different sources. Apparently, some languages only have one of them, but let me just now say that all of them have this kind of two ways of having the modification of a noun, either by direct modification, a little bit like adverbs modify projections of the verb. Adjectives in this kind of direct modification modify the noun phrase. And then you have another source which comes for free, in a sense, because for predicative adjectives, those that can stand in the predicate of a copula or a predicative verb, they can also enter a relative clause which can be reduced. So, as we say that when you have a reduced verbal participial relative clause, like the books recently arrived, you have which have recently arrived, you delete or you don't pronounce the WH relative and the auxiliary, and you have the participial there. Or let me say, who is here. Then you can also have who is red, which is red, or who is tall, and then you have a reduced version of that where red remains the only exponent of the relative clause. Now, crucially, there is a difference between these two sources, because with the direct modification, you only have non-predicative adjectives, namely adjectives that cannot be found after a copula, and in the reduced relative clause source, you can only have adjectives that are predicative. One has to be careful, of course, because some adjectives can be either predicative or not. They can enter both sources. So one has to be careful about that. So anyway, start from the order that we saw yesterday, where reduced relative clauses, we'll see tomorrow some evidence that participial reduced relative clauses of the Romance and English type are actually below numerals, cardinal numerals, but they are above other kinds of APs of the direct modification type. Then you have demonstratives and numerals above them. Now, the thing that I put in two is a very compact representation of what we will be looking at now with actual examples. The two sources not only are located in two different positions of the hierarchy of the nominal phrase, with the reduced relative clause type being higher than the direct modification, but they differ in terms of their semantics. So as you see in 2A, the reduced reticulosaurs, as we will see, they have only restrictive interpretation, intersective interpretation, and so on for the rest. I don't read them now. Whereas the direct modification source has almost virtually the opposite interpretations. Non-restrictive, non-intersective, modal reading, and so on. You see that. Now, if you go to 3, you see a first glance of what is the difference between English and Italian, or Germanic, although English is kind of special in the Germanic and Slavic languages in having some adjectives following the noun. Polish is apparently the most clear case of a Slavic language which has also some following adjective following the noun, and I'm told that Russian also allows some adjectives to follow the noun, but they are very special and very... Anyway, so what you find in English is the following, that an adjective that precedes the noun is ambiguous with respect to all of these interpretations, 2A and 2B, and it's unambiguous when it follows, if it can follow. In Italian, it's the opposite. It's unambiguous when the adjective precedes, and it's ambiguous when it follows. And the non-ambiguity of English and Italian are the opposite. So that's the pattern. It means that if you have a certain interpretation in English in postnominal position, you cannot have it in prenominal position in Italian, and vice versa. So let's start with the various battery of these semantic distinctions. So the restrictive, non-restrictive interpretation. So when you say every blessed person was healed, I took this from work by Bollinger and Larson. It's ambiguous. It means all the people, and by the way, they were blessed, were healed. Whereas the second interpretation is that only the people that were blessed by someone were healed, not all of them. That's the restrictive interpretation. In postnominal position in English, there is no ambiguity. Only the restrictive interpretation survives. So if you say, every person blessed was healed, it means only those that were blessed were healed. In Italian, if you look at 6 and 7, you find the opposite. So if you have a prenominal adjective, it's unambiguously non-restrictive. So if you say the boring classes of Ferry can only mean that all of them were boring. If you put it postnominally, 7a, le lezioni noiose, then it's ambiguous. Can either mean all of them were boring or only those that were boring are remembered by everybody. Then you have the intersective, non-intersective distinction, again from work from Ziegel and Larson. So if you say in English, I've never met a more beautiful dancer than Mary, it's ambiguous between the intersective, non-intersective, meaning that the intersective is when you intersect the set of dancers and the set of beautiful things. And you say that the dancer is also a beautiful thing, a beautiful person. In the other non-intersective interpretation, you interpret it adverbially. It's like saying, she dances beautifully. That's the non-intersective interpretation. You're not intersecting the set of dancers and the set of beautiful things, but you're saying that her way of dancing is beautiful. And in postnominal position, using this special, because beautiful alone cannot stand in postnominal position, you have to make it heavier, but then it becomes unambiguous. So I've never met a dancer more beautiful than Mary, means that she's a beautiful person. It cannot mean that she dances beautiful. So the non-intersective interpretation is lost. In Italian, it's the same pattern, it's the opposite. If you say a good forward would never do such a thing, it means that he is good at playing forward. If you say un attaccante buono, post-nominally, then it's ambiguous between good at playing forward or good-hearted forward. Third case, implicit relative clause and modal readings. In English, if you have a pre-nominal possible, that's ambiguous. So if you say, Mary will interview every possible candidate, it can mean modal reading, every potential candidate. Or it can mean, as a reduced relative clause, Mary will interview every candidate that it is possible for her to interview. So that's the reduced relative clause interpretation. If you put possible in post-nominal position, you only get the reduced relative clause interpretation. You cannot get the modal interpretation, potential candidate. Italian, once again, is the opposite. So if you say possibile candidato, 14a, then only the modal reading is possible, whereas in 15a, when you put it post-nominally, it's ambiguous between the two. Now, there are quite many, and let me skip relative to a comparison and absolute reading, and let's go to comparative to 20, 21, 22, 23. That has to do with the ambiguity of, well, it doesn't matter. So if you look at 28, who climbed the highest snowy mountain, it's ambiguous between an absolute interpretation, that's the highest of all, Mount Everest, whereas you also can get a comparative interpretation of the superlative, meaning you are talking about three friends who climbed three different mountains, and you are asking who climbed the highest snowy mountain among those three. So that's a comparative interpretation. In English, you cannot put the superlative after the noun, so we cannot know exactly how it would be interpreted, but that doesn't matter because Italian, which has the usual pattern, shows the other side of the coin. So if you put in pre-nominal position, then you only get the absolute interpretation. 22a, la più alta montagna nevata, that can only mean Mount Everest. It cannot mean the highest, the higher among those three. If you put it post-nominally, then it's ambiguous. So we would guess that in English, if it were possible, then you would only get the comparative and not the absolute interpretation, but we cannot know. Another difference which has been noticed by two semanticists is the epistemic and evaluative reading of adjectives like unknown or undisclosed and other negative ones. So if you say Maria lives in some unknown village in the south of France, it can be an evaluative reading, which means that it's not a well-known one. It's an unknown village. It's not a famous one. Or it's once again a reduced relative clause, which can be paraphrased with Maria lives in some village, but it's not known which one it is. It's some unknown village. I don't know if in Russian you have the same ambiguity with such adjectives. You should probably have it. In Italian, once again, in English you cannot see, because you cannot have unknown in post-nominal position. In Italian you can have it pre-nominal and post-nominally, and once again, only one of the two interpretations is possible. In the pre-nominal position, and it's the evaluative, and not the reduced relative clause one. And in post-nominal position, it's ambiguous, 27. So I go fast because these are. Another case is what has been done to discourse anaphoric different versus NP-dependent reading of different. So if you say, John and Mary live in different cities, it can mean in the NP-dependent reading that John lives in a city which is different from the city that Mary lives in. But there is another interpretation, which is the discourse anaphoric one. If you mention a certain city, let's say Moscow, and then you say, well, John and Mary live in different cities, it can mean that they live in cities which are different from Moscow, although they could be the same city where they live. See the difference with the two kinds of interpretations. In English, in postnominal position, once again, you cannot tell. In Italian, you can tell. And in pre-nominal position, only the NP-dependent reading is possible, and not the discourse anaphoric reading. So only John lives in a city which is different from the city that Mary lives. Then there is the specific, non-specific readings. Here, apparently, there is a break of the pattern in English, because not only in pre-nominal position is the adjective ambiguous, it's also ambiguous in post-nominal position. But we will see that this is not a counterexample. So if you say John wants to burn a nearby house, it can be specific. He has in mind a particular house he wants to burn of his enemy, or is a pyromaniac. It doesn't matter which house, is going to burn one. It's not specific. And the same ambiguity survives in postnominal position 33. In Italian, in fact, there is a difference. So in pre-nominal position, it's unambiguous and it's only specific. This was discovered, this effect of the pre-nominal adjective in Romance languages, which in an indefinite noun phrase force the specific interpretation, was noticed in Spanish, because in Spanish there is an overt way that you see the ungrammaticality, whereas in Italian you have to you have to do some introspection and find, which you find in footnote 4, some context that make it clear. But in Spanish, at the end of footnote 4, you see the difference that you see in 3. Now, I should recall that in Spanish, an object, indefinite object, has to be preceded by the preposition a if it's human and specific. If it's not specific, it does not need to be preceded by a preposition. So, for example, in 3b, busco a un actor famoso, here you have ambiguity between the specific, non-specific, and so the optionality is only apparent, so the a becomes obligatory under the specific interpretation and is omitted under the non-specific one. But the crucial example is 3a, because here, if you put the adjective in pre-nominal position, then a becomes obligatory. So that was why it was noticed of all the Romance languages. I mean, the effect of a pre-nominal adjective was noticed there, because you have ungrammaticality coming out. And finally, the stage level, individual level reading, again discussed by Bollinger and Larson. If you say the navigable rivers are not many, it can mean that they are always navigable, individual level, or that they happen to be navigable right now because there is nothing that precludes stage level. And in post-nominal position 37a, it's again ambiguous. Once again, not a counterexample to the pattern. Italian shows that they, in prenominal position, the invisible stars can only mean that they are permanently invisible, not that they happen to be visible because a cloud is passing above them. If you put them in postnominal position, 39A, then you get ambiguity. It's stage level or individual level. Then there are, but I will skip that, the literal and idiomatic reading. In English, only prenominally idiomatic reading is possible. In Italian, it's possible both prenominally and postnominally, for reasons that we'll come back to. So the summary is given in 42 with some gaps. That doesn't matter. The postnominal adjective in English, as you see, have some gaps, 42, and 43 gives the case of Italian. So I don't know if you can see immediately from all of these cases, but Italian, I mean, in English, you have ambiguity in prenominal position, and in postnominal position where you can have the adjective, you only have restrictive, intersective, specific literal meaning, implicit relative clause, whereas in Italian, these are found prenominally, these interpretations, whereas postnominally, you have ambiguity. So that looks like a very curious pattern. Why should you find these different interpretations? Although they are the same, so it must be the case that the two languages start out from one and the same structure, and then they mix up things. At least Italian mix up things, as we shall see. Now, let me start by saying that there is evidence that the postnominal position of adjectives in English, which is very limited. There is only few classes of adjectives that can be there, but they all behave the same. They have exactly the same interpretations that predicative adjectives in relative clauses have, which makes it plausible to say that the source, as has already been argued by Larsson and Marusic that I mentioned, the only source of a postnominal adjective in English is that of a relative clause, of a reduced relative clause. And this becomes visible if you look at 44, 45, and 46. In 44, you see that when you have the possible in postnominal position, Mary will interview every candidate possible, you only have the interpretation of a reduced relative clause. You don't have the modal interpretation. So that is lost. Remember earlier that the ambiguity of 44A will interview every possible candidate, can be potential, or that it was possible for her to interview. If you put possible in postnominal position, it's only a relative clause. Then there are cases like, for example, present, which in English is ambiguous in prenominal and postnominal position. In prenominal position is interpreted temporally. The present editors means the current editors, whereas the editors present means the editors who are here. That's a locative interpretation. And this is the only interpretation that you get of present in the predicative position, the predicate position of a relative clause. So the editors who are present cannot mean who are current, can only mean who are here. A minimal pair is given in 46, so that live can only be prenominal, and alive can only be postnominal. And the only adjectives that is found in a relative clause is alive. Again, the postnominal position of the adjective 46b is exactly the same as the predicate of a relative clause. So that seems to lead to 47, so that the position of adjectives following the noun in English is from a reduced relative clause. In the second step, so this is the first step. So we reach the conclusion that adjectives following the noun are only, come only from reduced relative clause. The second step is to look at the ambiguity in pre-nominal position. It's not simply a lexical ambiguity, as was observed by Larson and Maruzic, because the two interpretations are ordered. So the restrictive interpretation precedes the non-restrictive interpretation, and as we will see later, the intersective interpretation precedes the non-intersective interpretation of the same adjective. So if you look at 48a, if you say the visible stars, the native speaker feel that the first of the two is the restrictive, it has to be interpreted restrictively, and the second non-restrictively, and this becomes clearer if you say the invisible visible stars, which is fine, because there may be stars which are visible at the naked eye, which happen to be invisible because of a cloud. But it becomes impossible to say the visible invisible stars, unless you, in a context where you use a telescope. In that case, it could be that some stars that are generally invisible become visible because of the telescope. Otherwise, that's impossible. And the same, as I said earlier, intersective, non-intersective, you say, she's a beautiful, beautiful dancer. The interpretation of the first beautiful is intersective, beautiful person, and the second is non-intersective. She dances beautifully. More telling even is the case of possible, because apparently for Larson you can combine two possible and say Mary interviewed every possible candidate, meaning every potential candidate which it was possible for her to interview. And the first possible is reduced relative clause, and the second is the modal interpretation. So 51 gives you the basic things that we have just seen. Pre-nominally, you have two fields of adjectives. The first field is from a reduced relative clause, because it has exactly the same meanings of the adjective in postnominal position, which we already established has as a source only the relative clause. And the two are identical. In between, I mean, closer to the noun, is the opposite interpretations of the adjective. That's the non-restrictive, non-intersective modal. What is the situation in Italian? In Italian, you see in 53. And here you see that pre-nominally there is no ambiguity. Then you have ambiguity to the right. But here, what we see is that from 54, 55, and 56 is that there is a mirror image. Namely, the non-restrictive, non-intersective, and modal interpretation found postnominally is closer to the noun than the restrictive, intersective, implicit relative clause reading. So just take one. For example, if you say 56, he tried to interview every candidate potential possible, possibile. It's only the second which is a relative clause, and the first is potential. So it's the mirror image of English. And this is typical because we have many mirror images. Well, I'll say something later. Now here, the two interpretations in pre-nominal position and the leftmost of the two post-nominal positions are identical. So the question arises, are they different positions or is this an optical illusion, that in fact they are only one position, and we have the impression that they are two because of certain movements that occur. And this is what I will argue, that there's actually only one interpretation, or only one position structurally, and that the two languages differ with respect to what moves to where. So if you look at the summary 57, this just recalls what I just said. So you have, in English, adjective from reduced relative clauses prenominally, which precede direct modification adjectives, and in postnominal position, only with the reduced relative clause source. In Italian, prenominally direct modification only, and following direct modification, and then the reduced relative clause. So how can we derive the two different orders from a single structure? The single structure is the one you see in 58, where you have, as in fact we saw in English, the relative clause source being higher than direct modification source. And in English what happens is that you are allowed to pipe with the noun phrase the direct modification adjectives and move them around to give the impression that there is a position after the noun of the AP in reduced relative clause. But actually, it's one single position, which if you don't move, you find it to the left. And if you move, and you're allowed to do it only in certain cases, then you find it to the right of the noun. So, for example, if you start with 60, and you have the available, which is one of those blé adjectives that can be postnominal in English, and then you have former, which is a modal adjective, adverbial adjective that is non-predicative, and so can only be direct modification. Then, if you don't do anything, you get the available former students. But you can also say the former students available. And that seems to correspond to something that we know in English you are allowed to do. Namely, if you look at 61, with a participial relative clause, which can appear prenominally, the recently departed former students, you can there too have movement of former students above recently departed, so that you have the impression that there are two positions of the reduced relative clause, or in this case, the participial one. German, for example, does not allow that. Reduced relative clauses are only prenominal. It's only English that allows, with certain restrictions, both prenominal and postnominal relative clause. Italian, as we will see now, allows only postnominal reduced relative clauses, and that's part of the cause of the difference with English. So, if you look now at Italian, I come back to the fact that in English, you generally, with most adjectives, they cannot appear postnominally, like in 62. You cannot say the sea is free, the child is hungry, hungry or angry, and so on. Now, in Italian, if you look at 63, you are allowed to do the same thing with, as in English, namely doing piping of the regressive type with certain adjectives, but not with all. And so you can have 64 from un corrotto giovane avvocato. You can also have un avvocato giovane, when un giovane avvocato corrotto, I didn't put it there, or un avvocato giovane corrotto, where you first move avvocato, lawyer, around giovane, young, and then that's the whose picture of progressive piping, and then again by progressive piping, you move avvocato giovane above corrotto, which is reduced relative clause. And especially, as you see in 65, in Italian, as I said, you are not allowed to leave the pre-nominal reduced relative clause prenominally. You have to move the noun phrase around it, as in fact you have to do with all relative clauses. So you start even with reduced relative clauses, and I would say you start even with adjectives, as opposed to most cases in English. I don't know if this is clear enough. I mean, there is a very systematic, just let me give you. Now here, in fact, we have non-predicative adjectives, especially, I mean, musicale, musical, which is a classificatory adjective. You cannot say that comedy is musical to mean the same thing as musical comedy, which is a subclass of comedies. Now, in English, provenance or nationality has to precede classificatory adjectives. In Italian, as you see, it's the mirror image. You cannot have the same order. It's the mirror image, but with the fact that musical has to be adjacent to commedia, and the nationality adjective has to be further away. And the idea is the same. Italian starts out as English and does what we have seen for the, what we had seen with Greenberg's Universal 20. So you first move in Italian. Well, suppose that this is Italian, but it starts out having the same structure as English. You take the noun and you move it to the left of musical. Then, once you do that, you have to move the entire sequence with the same piping, and you move it around here. So you get una commedia musicale americana, and you reverse the order. That's the same thing that we saw yesterday and with so the fact that pre-nominally you only have adjectives that do not derive from a relative clause is related to the fact that we have just seen that in Italian reduced relative clauses cannot stay to the left of the noun, but end up to the right as a function of the obligatory movement of the noun phrase above reduced relative clauses, just as the movement is obligatory above finite restrictives and non-restrictives. So languages differ. If you start out thinking that, as I will say tomorrow, that relative clauses are modifiers and are part of the extended projection of the noun phrase inserted to the left, so that the basic order is reflected in ad final languages where they are pre-nominal relative clauses. In ad initial languages, they end up post-nominal for the reasons that we saw, namely of the movement of the progressive piping that takes up the noun phrase around the edge. I don't know if that's clear, but yeah. Now a bit more briefly, the basic syntactic properties of the two sources of adjectives. Now, syntactically, as you see on page 9, direct modification adjectives are non-predicative, so you cannot say 66A, the winner is probable to mean the probable winner, namely the person who is probably going to win. Or that friend is old. When you say an old friend, that cannot mean of long standing, it can only mean aged. It's closer to the noun, second property, than the other source that we reduced to the close source, as we saw, 67. So if you say a fat, heavy drinker, now heavy in English is ambiguous between weighing a lot or drinking a lot. In this case, heavy drinker means someone who drinks a lot. And fat means fat. If you reverse the order, a heavy fat drinker, it can no longer mean a fat person who drinks a lot, but only who is heavy. Third property, they are maximal projections, namely they are phrases, not just heads, because you can modify them, or they can even have complements. 68, the most probable winner, bigger than usual, pasta eater, or how old a friend is he, which can retain the long standing. And this comes to the question that raised yesterday by one of the students, that in English, well, let me go on before I get to that. Fourth property is that they are a closed functional class. I mean, this is arguably so, as we see from some languages, where we know that the class of adjectives is very limited, and given the fact that they are somehow functional, it is not so surprising that they should be, that non-predicative adjectives should form a small class even. And certain languages seem to have only 8 or 6 adjectives. And the other final property is that they are rigidly ordered. And this we can see in those languages that happen not to use adjectives from reduced relative clauses, like Yoruba, this African language, which according to the description of Ajiboye, which I cite here, says that the order, the rigid order is color adjectives following the noun, then followed by size adjectives, then followed by quality adjectives, which is the mirror image of what you find in English with the unmarked order. Of course, in English you can reverse the order, but we saw yesterday that to do that, you need to put a heavy stress on the adjective that is out of place, and you have to have a special context. So if you look at footnote 9, I have one big brown dog. You can also say I have one brown big dog. But this is a correction of someone who probably said, oh, you have one big black dog. No, I have one brown big dog. So my take would be that since brown can also be predicative, it can enter both fields. It can enter the direct modification field, or it can enter as a reduced relative clause, the higher field. And so you have the impression of reversing the order because you are playing on two tables, so to speak. You are playing on the table of the direct modification, and you are playing on the other table. But if you take adjectives that cannot enter, that are non-predicative, then you see that you cannot reverse the order anymore. So even English shows a very rigid order. So for example, if you look at for, he is an alleged hard worker, mean these are two non-predicative adjectives. So you cannot say the worker is alleged and the worker is hard to mean he works a lot. And here you cannot, unless you change the meaning completely, you cannot say he is a hard alleged worker. Or he is a good electrical engineer. You cannot say he was an electrical good engineer. That's completely impossible. I don't think that movement for focus reason here, although you have to stress the element in the adjective which is in the reduced logic clause, is the answer, because then you would expect 4 and 5 of note 9 to be also possible, which is not the case. And adjectives in reduced logic clauses, given in 4.2, have different properties, so they are necessarily predicative, though I said the same lexical entry may enter both modifications. They are further away than direct modification adjectives, as we saw. They are maximal projections. They seem to be an open class, and they are not rigidly ordered like reduced relative clauses. So the two types of adjectives seem to really. So let me stop here because that's probably going too far and it's not so interesting. Maybe let me go to the very last 2 pages which treat Russian, even that here. And so Russian, as I said earlier, should behave like English, except for the fact that it does not allow post-nominal adjectives, except some people have claimed that some classificatory adjectives and special registers also be post-nominal. But now, in pre-nominal position, the adjectives are in the long form, and only when they are predicates they are in the short form. This is different from Serbo-Croatian, where in pre-nominal position adjectives can be either short form, special interpretations, and long form, and in predicate position they say they cannot normally have a long form unless you have a kind of ellipsis or some kind. So let's see if you agree with the facts. So in page 12, so you say 39, novi, but not nov. This is from Peret 5. So the new house stands on the hill. In Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, you can either say novi, long form, or nov, short form. In predicate position, Russian seems to allow both the short form and the long form, 41. In Serbian, in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, only the short form is possible. And the long form, they say, is possible if you understand an empty noun there. But Russian should be the same. So there is a famous distinction that Ziegel, in her analysis of Russian adjectives, makes in 43. So if you say studentka umna, as opposed to studentka umnaya, there seems to be a difference in meaning. So when you say studentka umna, you're saying the student is intelligent among everyone, not specifically restricted to students. But if you say studentka umnaya, you seem to be saying that she is intelligent as a student. Is that right? Don't seem to be convinced. This is what I mean, it's whenever you cannot have such a situation in which you are restricting the application of the adjective to the same noun that it modifies, then you only get apparently the short form. This is given in 44. So here it doesn't make any sense to say the space is an infinite one because there is only one space. Or to come home is very pleasant and not is a very pleasant coming home. Or everything is clear and not everything is a clear everything or a clear one. So that here you don't have a choice, you only use the short form. However, I mean, Siegel went a little bit further, saying that in Russian, the long form was always non-intersective, non-restrictive, whereas the short form in predicate position could be more freely. But then Larsson noted that you apparently have the same ambiguity when you say krasivi tanzor. Can be that the dancer is a beautiful woman or that she dances beautifully. I don't know if you agree with that. So that means that it's like English, that you have both sources of adjectives in prenominal position, and although you don't, I don't know if you can say krasivi tanzor. What is the interpretation there? That it should be like in English. But here, as opposed to Bosnian Serb operation, the long form in prenominal position in Russian should go together with the difference in 45. So in generally a participle is not in the long form when it's used as a participle. But if it's used as a modifier, as in 45b, then it has to be long form. And so it seems that in Russian, at least, Serbo-Croatian is a little bit different, all modifiers have to be in the long form, no matter what interpretations they have, whether they come from a reduced relative clause or from the direct modification one. So I thought of giving just to see whether it was correct or not. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So, questions, comments, your thoughts, your, I don't know, evaluations of examples.
I don't know. I think it's not the best sentence.
Which one?
No.
I also thought that Domnov is not a very great sentence, but then I think that it's not so good because of phonetic reasons and not syntactic or morphological. I think that Dom Star, the house is old, is just as bad.
And which phonetic reason?
And because we have two words with closed syllables that just go together. Квартира новая. Take for example, моя квартира новая. That's already a lot better. Don't you think so? Мой дом.
I don't know how many know. Okay, more, yeah.
One more question. You seem to claim that in Italian idiomatic versus literal meanings don't correlate with other features, but the reference grammars of French and Italian seem to suggest that when one and the same adjective can be used in pre and post position, that it's often the case that in preposition it has the idiomatic meaning, and in post position it hasn't, but never the other way around. Is that true? Like
No.
grandomo or grandon?
Oh, there are many cases which are typically found in reference grammars where the same adjective in pre and postnominal position, like in English present that we saw, have completely different meanings. Sometimes that depends on the fact that they are different adjectives. So, for example, if you say le numerose famiglie, that means the many families. And if you say le famiglie numerose, that means which have many relatives inside. So it's not many families, but families with many people inside. So it's completely different meaning. Or if you say una certa vittoria e una vittoria certa, one means a certain victory, and the other means a sure victory. So those are completely different meanings, and they can co-occur. So you can say numerose famiglie numerose, or una certa vittoria certa. So that shows that not only these are, they have different meanings, but they occupy different positions. I mean, the numerose in front of the noun is a kind of a quantifier, so it means almost many, although it's an adjective. And then there are some more subtle cases, like un grand'uomo, un uomo grande, or un vecchio amico, an old friend, and un amico vecchio, a friend old, which can only mean a friend aged with many years, not a long-standing. But then there are adjectives that will totally have the same meaning. And so if you say size adjectives, for example, you can say l'enorme cupola di San Pietro, or la cupola enorme di San Pietro. That's completely identical. As with the idioms, I gave actually one case here. It's on page, on page 5. Look, you can, in English, apparently, it's only in pre-nominal position. I mean, idioms have the property that they are non-intersective. So when you say he has a quick temper, that means that he gets angry easily, and it has only remotely to do with quick, I mean, with the meaning of quick. And we saw that non-intersective interpretations are only possible with direct modification adjective. Now, so we expect that in English, we will never find an idiom with a post-nominal adjective, because it must be a relative clause, and relative clauses are intersective. So you should not be able to. But we saw that in Italian, non-intersectivity can be pre-nominal and also post-nominal. And actually, if you look at 41, you get idioms with a pre-nominal adjective. It's low alloy, meaning bad quality, but you can also say at irons short, meaning they are in bad terms. So that seems to go along with the apparent double position of non-intersective adjectives in Italian. I know that, I mean, I had to, convince my own native speakers that in Italian you do find adjectives, I mean, I'm joking because that there are classes of adjectives that are absolutely have the same meaning in pre and post-nominal position, because there are also many that change meaning, but then you cannot generalize that to all adjectives. And grammars, understandably maybe, have focused on those that mean different things and mean different ways, whether you put them pre or post-nominal. Anyway, I don't know.
So have a small question, but maybe it's not for you, but for Larsen. I wonder what they mean by non-restrictive in 48, actually. So the visible stars. So why in this case the second visible is treated as non-restricted because
No, it's restricted.
yeah, so you have the visible stars. That's 48A, right?
Yes, that's right. And the first one is restrictive,
And the second one,
and the second one also visible, the capitalized visible is restrictive. So,
no, I mean 48A.
48, the other one, oh, I see what you mean. You mean that even the second visible should be restricted?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is an interesting question, because when you say a hard worker, let's say, you could have the impression that hard there is restricting worker. Yet it cannot be used, as a predicative adjective, which is the typical way of, in general, the adjectives that in Romance are prenominal, although, there is a very clear case, let me give you a clear case in Italian, although you don't have the intuitions, but I didn't talk about the fact that in Italian the situation is more complex because certain adjectives have to be, the lowest, have to be to the right of the noun. That is classificatory, nationality, and typically also color and shape. And only size and quality can be prenominal, and the others are. Now, if you take a color adjective, and if you say, I like le verdi colline della Toscana, the green hills of Tuscany, or the white cliffs of Dover, you can only understand that as no restrictive, because it's an inherent quality of the hills. All of them are green, all of them are white, and you're not distinguishing white from. So in Italian we have a special window where we see more clearly, because of the intuition we have, that prenominally it's clearly, it's absolutely no restrictive. So even even when you say the invisible stars, le invisibili stelle di Andromeda, that means that it's an inherent quality. Maybe you could say it's a different notion of restriction, maybe. I don't know what to say, but certainly it's not the kind of restriction that goes along with differentiating a set from another set, which is typical.
In fact, there are visible stars and there are invisible stars. And some visible stars are visible.
No, the question is, when you say there are, no, it's, let me see. When you use from my intuition about Italian, you cannot, an English speaker or a Russian speaker, I think, cannot have the same clear intuition, because both fields are prenominal. So when I say le invisibili stelle di Andromeda, I am not distinguishing visible from invisible stars.
Sure.
I'm saying this is a property of those stars of being invisible. I know that it's because I've been asked, given that this is a counterexample, because one feels that there is some kind of restriction because you are, but actually you are using not to restrict, but to qualify as a property. It's a very good concept, I don't know.
Well, so it would help in English. Again, if you add like a name of constellation there, so visible stars of blah blah blah.
Sure.
So that noun itself comes with some restrictor that is not pronounced, and then the adjective that modifies the whole complex of the noun with that unpronounced restrictor. So the adjective that modifies that is now not restrictive. I guess that's the.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
True. And I did it unconsciously when I said in Italian,
Yeah,
the Andromeda.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
By the way, do you have near emphatic repetitions like bella bellissima or nero nero?
Oh,
In Russian, they seem to occur on the first position, but I'm not sure about that.
you mean
Nero nero, or something like that.
whether the repetition of the adjective, which translates into molto, nero,
Yeah, yes.
can be
Maybe
prenominal.
in the superlative, like bellissimo.
Yeah, bellissimo can be prenominal. Is that the question you asked?
I mean repetitions was,
Un bellissimo bellissimo.
oh, bella bellissimo.
Ah, bello. Well, I guess I would prefer un bellissimo bel sorriso. A beautiful, nice smile or something. Cioè, putting bellissimo before the non-superlative.
And they both proceed.
And they both precede, yes. Yeah, I didn't say, but both fields can host more than one adjective. In Italian you can say la mia povera vecchia mamma, my poor old mother. And both are non-restrictive, non-intersective. So you can have more than one. I mean, prenominally, generally, you don't easily have more than two, I guess. It's difficult to have three, I think. But because the prenominal adjective are limited anyway in terms of class, because most classes have to end up post-nominally in Italian. But these are also functional adjectives, it seems to me, because you find languages where, for example, poor, my poor mother, which is clearly non-restrictive, are given with a suffix. So I found grammars where I say caritative suffix, meaning poor, in the sense not without money, but pity, pitiful. And also old, you find. So they seem to be really grammatical kinds of modifications. Maybe, I don't know, it has to be looked into. Then the question of the repetition, we also use it piano piano, nero nero, to mean very. And then the superlative, I said something yesterday, is a special case because there is evidence that it's a very high position that adjectives reach. So in English, it's the only time you can invert alleged hard. Remember that I said that you can say an alleged hard worker, but not a hard alleged worker. But you are allowed to say the hardest alleged worker that I've ever seen. I don't know if are you a native speaker of English or no? No, because you. And this was given to me by Kate as a possible And in Persian, the only adjectives that are prenominal are superlative, are in the superlative form, which means that the noun does not reach up there. It inverts with the normal adjectives, but does not reach. And I found one language where you have a particle, which they gloss as superlative. Then you have numeral, and then you have the adjective. And they say it's like the two tallest buildings. You have superlative, two tall building. So it really means, and in English, I've been also told that you can say the tallest two buildings that I have seen, preceding, you cannot say the tall two buildings, but if you make it superlative, then you can put. So really, they are different places. I think one should really look into the slots that all of these elements occupy. That's what the cartographic kind of enterprise is. And they generally, one does not devote much time to that, but I think you discover that things really occupy different positions, though it's hard to see sometimes because of that.
So,
Just a very quick question regarding the motorized subsection 2.3. Is there, so, okay, this is all very nice about the available slots for the adjectives within the ending.
I have to get closer, sorry.
What I would like to know, is there any motivation behind putting these slots? Because what I'm feeling while trying to parse the examples from 48 to 50 would be rather as the
From 40, sorry?
48, from 48 to 50, which would be not really semantic stuff, but much rather stuff dealing with focus or topic or whatever. Whatever is capitalized seems to be a derived stuff in the sort of introducing something focal nature. So, do you know of any references that Larson and Marusic and other people probably make to this?
Well, I don't think they ever consider the possibility of a focalization in the case, although, as I said, the first of the two adjectives, beautiful, beautiful dancer, has to be more heavily stressed.
Yes.
But, I mean, one could envisage the possibility of having, let's say, a focus position very high in the structure where one adjective moves to, especially in the brown big dog. I have a brown big dog. But as I said, first here they are two adjectives of the same kind, and they are interpreted differently in terms of intersectivity. So why should the intersective adjective be necessarily focused as opposed to the other? It's not clear. And also the other question was, why can you not focalize all adjectives, changing their order? I mean, you can do that apparently only with predicative adjectives. We saw some examples. So you cannot say an electrical good engineer or a hard-edged worker. So only when you have adjectives that can be predicative, because brown or black, you can say that's black, that's brown, and with those you are allowed to invert in English. But I think we can still say that English has a rigid order because the unmarked order corresponds to the rigid order of Yoruba. So that means that there must be a very strict, only that English has this other source that allows the apparent reversal. But it's only apparent, I think. I don't know if you agree or not, maybe not.
I arrived to these questions solely by looking at the non-restrictive modifier into the immediate left of the noun phrase, because what has been shown previously by Potts and other people is that non-restrictive modifiers are actually obeying predicate modification operation, and they are actually obeying it pretty high in the tree. So
Which ones? I didn't get, which ones?
the non-restrictive modifiers have been proven to adjoin to the NP already at a very late stage of the derivation.
Which ones?
I don't know, like consider the familiar examples, but this will be messing up the whole picture, I think. Like Lance the cyclist and whatever.
I didn't get it. Sorry. Say it again.
Okay, the example of examples would be the first examples which has popped up. To mind would be Lance the cyclist and the well, I cannot think of non-restrictive adjectives in English because I'm a non-native speaker, so this will not help a lot.
Well, let me give you one. Maybe in a sense, I mean, nearby can be used restrictively and non-restrictively. So we saw that it can precede the noun or follow. So he wants to burn a nearby house or a house nearby. However, if you use a place name, so if you say, he is living in nearby Manchester. That means that Manchester is nearby him, but you cannot use it postnominally there because you cannot differentiate one Manchester from another. So there you see that in postnominal position, it's another indication that you only get restrictive interpretations because you cannot use nearby in that particular case. So I'm not sure I understood actually what you said, so maybe I'm going in different directions, but I don't know. Maybe later.
Okay. Thank you very much for today's lectures. So, thank you. Let's go.